One of the oldest tropes in RPGs, specifically those of the Japanese variety, has gotta be the random encounter. For the longest time, they were basically synonymous with the genre. Starting with the first JRPG ever in Dragon Quest, and for like the next following decade or so, I'd say random encounters were in like 95% of them. These were likely initially implemented for a multitude of reasons. For one, it was an easy transition from the overworld screen to the turn-based battle screen. 2, older hardware just didn't really have the capacity to process that much on screen at once. 3, it allowed them to pad on a lot of length to an otherwise maybe kind of short game. And 4, it just kind of took some time for some developers to think of other methods. It wasn't until games like Earthbound and Chrono Trigger came out that they were like, hey, maybe there's other ways to go about this. With each passing console generation, visible enemies on screen became more and more common. Nowadays, they've pretty much become the standard. So much so, in fact, that a lot of people now consider random encounters to be outdated and automatically a bad thing. Like when Eiyuden Chronicles came out recently, I know many that were disappointed that it had random encounters. I gotta be totally honest, I do generally prefer visible enemies over random encounters. Like 9 times out of 10, I'm gonna take that option. However, that's largely because of the way they've been implemented. I think if executed right, random encounters are not automatically outdated and can still serve a viable purpose in modern JRPGs. In fact, in some ways, they can even be better than visible enemies and can provide for a style of gameplay that they cannot. And so yeah, in this video, I'm gonna go to bat for one of the genre's most hated aspects, random encounters.
Leave me alone!
This will be a short, concise piece, as I just want to talk about why I think they can still have a place in modern RPGs and give a few examples on how we can make them not a nuisance and even fun and engaging. But first, just grab some snacks, sit back and relax as we play out the intro.
The light is your guide.
Dream is what keeps you going.
Now is the time to shape your story. Your fate is in your hands.
Alright, so I'm not really sure the best way to start this, but let's just give it a go. I think one of the biggest downfalls to random encounters is that it can discourage exploration. Like, we get these really cool and pretty maps to explore, but if the encounter rate is too high, it makes it to where it's like, well, now I don't want to explore because I'm getting in a battle every 10 seconds. So, how can we avoid this? For one, if there's an overworld map, just make it to where there's no random encounters there. Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross do this, and it works so well. Well, technically they have visible enemies in dungeons and not random encounters, but yeah, same idea. The overworld is free of encounters. The PlayStation version of Lunar also does this as well. I think overworld should be all about the sense of adventure and exploration, and you should be able to leisurely enjoy that. In this specific setting, I do think random encounters detract more than they add. However, in dungeons, I think the opposite is true. If there are visible enemies here and you can skip like every fight, it makes it to where dungeons are not challenging or intimidating at all. Dungeons used to be like this epic and menacing part of the game that you really had to make sure you were prepared for. With visible enemies though, you can kinda just waltz on through. You could say, well, you're gonna be underpowered for the boss fight then, and that's probably true, so you're gonna have to fight some of the enemies anyway, and if you're not underpowered, that just trivializes all regular battles and reinforces my previous point. But now it's a matter of how many do you choose to fight. You're kind of having to balance the game yourself at that point instead of the game balancing itself. I do see how this could be a good thing for some people though. But yeah, even if you fight against every enemy you come across once to try to be appropriately leveled, that kind of just seems like random encounters with extra steps. Doubly so if the visible enemies aren't even skippable. Crimson Gem Saga, I'm looking at you. Anyway, this is all just to prove a point that visible enemies in dungeons may not always be the best option. Plus, think of it from an immersion and realism factor as well. Like if you were in a dark cave, could you see an enemy from a few hundred feet away and be like, no, that thing looks pretty dangerous, I guess I'll go the other way then. No, it would likely surprise you and catch you off guard, hence a random encounter. The same thing goes if you were deep in a thick forest or jungle, or even like a desert or something if some sandworm or some shit came emerging from the sand. Nature can often be sneaky, and if you were in something else's natural territory and elements, it makes sense you would get surprised. On the contrary, if you were in a gigantic, open field like an overworld or something, you probably wouldn't get surprised. In this setting, you could see the enemies from a mile away and could probably just avoid them. That's why I think random encounters make sense in dungeons, but not on the overworld. Generally speaking, at least. Pokemon showed us all the way back in the late 90s that a combination can be done pretty well. There's both random encounters in dungeons and on the overworld, but only in select parts. In dungeons, random encounters can occur anywhere. On the overworld though, just in tall patches of grass only. This kinda ties back to what I was saying earlier. If you're on a trail or in an open field to where you could see enemies coming, random encounters don't make sense. But if you venture off into their territory, then, well, you're inviting the chance to maybe get ambushed. It's kind of crazy that Pokemon thought of this concept nearly 30 years ago and the fact that it works as well as it does, yet few games have tried to replicate this. Like imagine if a PS1 Final Fantasy had it to where on the overworld map, you could only get into random encounters if you veered off into like a forest or something. That would be so much better than just random encounters everywhere. To me, it makes perfect sense and it's kind of like the best of both worlds. We still get the element of surprise without it being overly annoying or punishing, and dungeons are still challenging. Another reason why I like random encounters in dungeons is the resource management aspect. Not only do you have to make sure you're the right level and have the right equipment to take on a dungeon, but you have to make sure you have enough items as well. Like you'll have to think about, will I have enough recovery items? If I use magic on these enemies, will I have enough left over for the boss? You know, stuff like that you gotta factor in. If there's visible enemies on screen that can be skipped, you don't have to consider any of this. You can just strut over to the boss, bypassing everything, and take that dude on with full health and magic. The remakes of Dragon Quest 7 and 8 are good examples of this, as I'm kinda torn about how I feel about them. They went from random encounters to visible enemies on screen, and I think there's pros and cons with both. On one hand, DQ8 has a gorgeous overworld. Taking out random encounters here so we can explore at our own pace, I like this. For dungeons though, yeah, I don't need to repeat myself, I've already explained how I feel about visible enemies in dungeons. Maybe a good balance could be reached by having visible enemies on the overworld and random encounters in dungeons. I don't know if I've seen that before. If anything, I think I've seen the opposite. Like in Lufia 2 for example, there's random encounters on the overworld but visible enemies in dungeons. Let's try the reverse sometime. Okay, what if you're now thinking, I get the thought process behind this all, but random encounters are still just too frequent and annoying for me. Well, there are ways to combat this. First of all, if you're in a room with a puzzle, no random encounters. The random encounter is a natural enemy of the puzzle. The last thing we need here is something interrupting our train of thought and getting us all disoriented in the room. I'm not 100% sure, but I think Wild Arms did this in some games, or some rooms at least. Speaking of Wild Arms though, some of the entries implement a system that allows you to skip some random encounters. I can't remember if 4 and 5 did, but I know 2 and 3 did. It's quite simple. When you're exploring and you're about to get in a fight, an explanation point will appear above your character's head, and if you're fast enough, you can press a button to cancel it. Only if it's white though. If it's red, you better square up, but you can't cancel it. I think in Wild Arms 2 this was kinda more random, but in Wild Arms 3 there's a meter associated with this. If you have some points to spend, you can skip fights. Again, except for if it's red though, you can't skip that. However, if it's green, that doesn't cost any points to skip. You can refill these points by collecting these little crystals in dungeons. There's also ways to upgrade this meter throughout the game. Overall, this is just a really cool system that I haven't really seen done, well, like ever maybe? I don't know, has another game done something like this? I think there's a lot of potential with this idea. It does take some proper balancing though. If it's too easy to skip fights, then, well, we're back to dungeons not being intimidating again. As always, moderation is key. Some other games like Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne and The Legend of Dragoon do let you know when you're about to get in a battle. Like the latter, for example, will have this arrow above your character's head that will turn from green to yellow to red. However, you can't do anything about it, which makes this feature kind of cool, but also not really helpful at all. It's like if someone told you, hey, I'm about to nail you with this dodgeball, and you were like, oh, well, I guess I'll just move out of the way then, right? And they're like, well, actually, you can't, so yeah, enjoy this face full of rubber, bitch. Many RPGs either give you a spell or an item to skip random encounters, and these are viable options too. I do think having some sort of system integrated into the gameplay to skip fights would still be better, but if there's not, these are very welcome. Honestly, I feel like I overlooked these as a kid. They can really help make a lot of older titles with random encounters way more playable. Games like Final Fantasy 8 and 10 let you unlock an ability later in the game that turns off random encounters, which was a super cool reward. Later re-releases of these games would give you an option to turn off random encounters right from the start though, so these abilities are pretty obsolete in those versions. They did the same for the re-releases of 6, 7, and 9 as well, and dude, these are so nice. It's like they finally realized, yeah, random encounters can still serve a viable purpose, but exploration should be placed at the forefront sometimes too. It's almost kind of sad how many old school RPGs are almost completely unplayable nowadays due to absurdly high encounter rates. There's so many amazing stories and set pieces and music out there that a lot of people will never get to experience just because they don't want to get in a battle every 10 seconds. This is why I'm such a big fan of having ways to manipulate the encounter rate. The indie RPGs Breath of Death 7 and Cthulhu Saves the World have a pretty interesting way of handling this. Dungeons have a fixed amount of random encounters, and after you hit that number, you won't run into any more. You can still get into battles though by selecting an option from the menu. This ensures you're always appropriately leveled and can only get overpowered if you choose to. The Bravely Default series takes this freedom even a step further though. In these games, you can just straight up control the encounter rate with percentages. 0 is the default standard rate, but you can also set it to 50%, 100%, negative 50%, and negative 100%. This flexibility is just so nice, dude. I love that I can choose to have no random encounters on the world map, but to keep them in dungeons. It's perfect. For me, that is. No one style is forced upon you, and that's pretty cool. At the end of the day, everything is just a preference. In this video, it may have seemed like I was pitting random encounters against visible enemies like one is better than the other, and that's really not the case. In reality, they're both totally viable and just a choice of game design. As with most things in life, it's all about the execution. I do get the disdain for random encounters. I think for the most part, outside of some exceptions, they've yet to really realize their full potential. But with that being said, that potential is definitely there. I would love to see these implemented in more creative ways in the future. Some titles have shown that they can be viable when used effectively, and I'm sure there's many other cool ideas out there that we've yet to even think of. Random encounters may not be for everyone, but not everything is for everyone, and that's okay. Even if they're not for you, they are for someone. So yeah, to reiterate one of the earliest points I made all the way back at the beginning of the video, I don't think random encounters are outdated, just simply a bit misunderstood and misused. Alright, and that about wraps up this video. Thanks for watching everyone, we hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please either consider hitting that like button or subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. How do you guys feel about random encounters? I'm sure many disagree with some of my points, and that's okay. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. One thing I forgot to mention in the main video is how in games like Suikoden, if you're overpowered, instead of running away, you can let enemies go, which increases the escape rate to 100%. You can get in and out of battles in like 5 seconds, it's pretty nice. If there's no way to manipulate the encounter rate, having a way to reliably escape can go a long way. Just wanted to throw that in there as I forgot to earlier. Anyway, as always, just want to give a huge thank you to our Patreon supporters, and of course an extra special shout out to our top patrons, Chris Carnaccio, Derek Drost, Jesse Spencer, Jump Rock, and Sino. All your support and generosity is very much appreciated. Other than that, thanks again for watching everyone, and hope you have an awesome day. This is Corbin from Gaming Productions. Until next time.